Thank you very much for everybody joining us this evening for the Georgetown on the Hill discussions on AI. I'm very happy to see everybody in person and welcome all the people that are attending online today. This is hosted by the Georgetown University Center for Business and Public Policy, which does academic and policy research at the intersection of business and public policy. This is the third session that we've hosted on artificial intelligence on the Hill. And the objective of these events really is to pool together the key stakeholders of artificial intelligence, which includes policymakers, industry experts, and academics. And what we try and do with these events is to create a platform where we share and disseminate rigorous empirical research to policymakers based on evidence-based policy advice. The key questions that we're looking to discuss and analyze today in this session are related to AI and productivity gains, why disparities emerge, and how can we help support broader diffusion. The way in which we have this session organized is first that we'll start with a discussion of preliminary research that's coming out on the productivity effects of AI. And after we've established that relationship and those initial evidence, then we'll talk about some of the bottlenecks and enablers of AI, which include AI in skills, compute in data centers, and the electricity grids. After which we'll have an integrated panel session where we'll allow all panelists to have a broader conversation across some of these broader themes. And then finally, we'll open it up to questions from the audience. But before I jump into the session, I'd like to give 2 minutes to each of the panel experts to introduce themselves and discuss their work and where their work lies at the intersection of business and public policy. And I think we'd just like to start down the board here, starting with Carol, and then Josh, and then Olivia and Rachel. So without further ado, go ahead, Carol.
Well, thank you, Tim. It really is my pleasure to be here. I'm obviously excited about my own research, and it's always fun to talk about it with an audience that's interested. I am a senior policy scholar at the Georgetown Center for Business and Public Policy, and I came there after a long career at the Federal Reserve in which I did research on productivity and macroeconomic activity. I also had a stint at the Conference Board, working there, doing business-oriented research. So I feel right at home here with the broad sort of mandate that Tim has given us.
Hi, I'm Josh Conley with LinkedIn. Previously, I was on the Hill for a really long time. I've been at LinkedIn for 4 years. We have 1.2 billion folks on platform, and a stack of data scientists and economists look really deeply at that. And more, unsurprisingly, we're looking really deeply at AI and the future of work and the current workforce. So I'll be speaking about that.
Hi, I'm Olivia Bokwe. I lead federal affairs for Amazon Web Services. We'll be talking about the expanding need of compute, energy, grid modernization, infra, really serving as the backbone, data centers serving as the backbone of AI infrastructure.
Right. My name is Rachel Murrell. I'm a senior research associate at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. I came to the Kennedy School after working at the business school on topics related to research productivity, innovation, and artificial intelligence. In my current role, I'm in charge of a fairly large portfolio of energy, technology, and energy policy research. The biggest right now is a joint program between our school and the School of Engineering looking at the impact of data centers on the grid. And the way we've been approaching this is 2 ways. We want to understand the current extent to which the data centers are impacting the grid, but then also how these data centers can be used as tools to help the grid. But yeah, very excited to be on this panel and to talk to everyone today.
Excellent. So as you can tell today, you're all in good hands. So let's start by framing the main topic of this event, and that's discussing AI and productivity. And I think up until recently, there's been a lot of anecdotal discussions about AI within the news media, but similar to the previous Solo paradox, we saw and heard discussions about the technology everywhere, but we didn't see it yet in the statistics. But Carol has a recent academic paper that actually is finding some evidence of this in the statistics. So I think we'd like to start framing the discussion here around her paper, and then we'll pass it along. So Carol, the first question I have for you, could you tell us a bit about your recent research on AI and productivity, and what are the main takeaways that you see thus far?
Sure, Tim. I'm happy to start this off. Well, the core claim of the work that I did with several other co-authors is simple. AI is not just a powerful tool. It's changing how we produce knowledge. We call this an innovation in the process of innovation. And that distinction matters for how you measure it and what you expect from it. A headline number: software capital, our empirical stand-in for AI-engendered economic activity, accounts for roughly half, that's half, of US productivity growth between 2017 and 2024. Its contribution doubled across the two periods we studied, that is from 2012 to 2017, and then looking at 2017 to 2024. And that basic finding is just not very well appreciated in the policy community, and it should be. In historical terms, AI's current impact is already larger than steam or electricity at comparable stages in diffusion. It's below the IT boom of 1995 to 2004 in absolute terms, quite a bit below. But the relative share of productivity explained is nearly identical. So the bottom line is, there is evidence that says that this is real, that it's large, and it's already beginning to impact the major macroeconomic aggregates that policymakers use.
That's really insightful, Carol, and thanks for sort of explaining the main takeaways of your paper. Now, if we were to dig a little deeper into the paper, could you help explain to us where the main channels of
there's two channels, and and the approach we used is very standard in studies that look at historical episodes of major innovations. First, there's a production effect, and this usually comes first and dominates the early stage of an innovation cycle. And in this case, the software producing industries, again, that's our proxy for AI, because remember we talked about it, how it accelerated, and that thrust is coming from AI. So the software producing industries, about 6% of the economy, that's sort of broadly defined, contributed about 40% of the post-2017 acceleration in total factor productivity. So highly concentrated, but highly productive. Second, and this is more important for policy, is a use effect. So businesses across the economy are investing in and deploying AI tools. And between 2017 and 2024, about 2/3 of the productivity effect that I quoted earlier came through this channel. What that 2/3 number tells you is that firms aren't just buying AI, they're reorganizing around it. R&D functions, marketing, logistics, strategy. And that's a deeper level of integration than early diffusion usually looks like. And it's a signal that the gains are likely to persist. So gains are broad-based. They're not just in the tech sector, and that's the most policy relevant finding.
Very insightful. And just focusing on another key theme of your research is the fact that the effects of the productivity effects of the technology appear to be uneven. And this is something similar that we saw to previous digital technologies. Why do we see such disparities between firms, across firms and countries, and who really benefits from AI?
Yeah, well, our paper is primarily an aggregate U.S. result, so I'll need to be clear about what I can and I can't say. But the mechanism that the innovation literature points to and that our framework supports is the role of complementary investment. Firms that arrive at the AI era with strong intangible foundations, good data, flexible R&D functions, organizational capability, can absorb and leverage AI much more effectively. Firms without those foundations can't just buy their way in. And that's the structural source of dispersion. And the same logic applies across countries, which you asked about. And there, we have a companion paper that covers Europe alongside the US. And the early evidence there is that the European economies entered this period with a less developed intangible capital base. And that's not just a lag, it's a structural gap that policy can actually address. So if you want to spread the gains, the lever is intangible investment. That has to do with skills, data, organizational capability, and that's where policy has traction.
Great. So you just alluded to where the conversation is going, and that's some of the bottlenecks and enablers of AI, including skills. And LinkedIn is one of those organizations that sits on a lot of data that can measure skills across the country quite well. So Josh, why don't we move next to you? Can you discuss a little bit about what are some of these important trends and shifts around AI skills that you're seeing at LinkedIn?
Yeah, so first we looked at France, Germany, the UK, India, and the US, and we found that potentially there's 6.6 trillion that could be unlocked in productivity. Then we zoomed in on the US and found that of that 6.6 trillion, 4.1 trillion could be unlocked in the US alone. The bottleneck that you speak of really is the lack of AI technical talent and AI literacy. But we're also hearing from folks that roughly 14% say they're getting AI training on the job. But we're hearing about 60% of executives are saying that really this lack of talent is central to why they can't scale. So from 2015 till now, when we map the skills to do roles that we have on LinkedIn, 25% of those skills are different today than they were in 2015 to do the same jobs. We project by 2030 for that number to be 70%. So that's 70% of the skills to do those same jobs are going to be different. We attribute that in large part due to AI. So we're seeing this kind of exponential shift in the skills needed. So what's that signal to workers? It's focusing on human-centric durable skills and then iteratively training and adapting and complementing those human-centric skills with the skills in demand.
So that's really interesting. So you've highlighted that there's quite a change in the skill composition for similar jobs over time. So that's suggesting that the demand for certain types of workers and skills is changing. But I can see that as two main bottlenecks. One of them is really like the demand or the lack of availability of technical talent. Mm-hmm. And there's also the ability of businesses to figure out how to integrate that within the organization. So which of those do you think matters the most?
It's a great question. So when we look at small, medium, and large businesses, about roughly 50% of them have integrated AI into their work streams. We're seeing 7% of all AI or all technical jobs now on platform are AI technical jobs. We've also seen a 70% increase year over year for jobs that require AI literacy.
I see. So a little bit of both.
Totally.
That's really good.
All the above.
Which makes our jobs as policymakers right. A little bit harder, I guess. Yeah. But that's very helpful. Where do you think firms struggle the most to build skill and talent within their organization? Is it partially training? Is it acquisition?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think, again, there's no perfect answer, but I think it's all of the above. It's like, how do you efficiently and scalably train your workforce? How do you map the skills needed to do roles? How do you predict how those skills that are needed are going to change? And then how do you in real time create a flexible and adaptive training framework to adhere and comport with that reality that's changing by the day?
Yeah. So sort of going back to Carol's original stance about the importance of complements for effective AI adoption and implementation, we know that much of the AI models that are being trained aren't being trained within servers, within within the premises of a business, but they're being trained in the cloud, in data centers. So Olivia, can we turn next to you? And let me ask this question. So as a major cloud provider of Amazon, how has demand for AI-related compute changed over the last few years?
Significantly. I have Mississippi top of mind because we just announced we're investing $25 billion now in Mississippi. Back in 2024, we announced a $10 billion investment, which was the largest in the state's history. In 2025, we did an additional $3 billion, bringing it up to $13 billion in the state. And now we just announced an additional $12 billion, bringing our Mississippi investments from 2024 to 2026 to $25 billion. We have similar sized investments in Indiana, in Ohio, Oregon. I mean, the demand is growing, the investments are growing, and I think that the demand for compute is a result of these investments needing to keep up with the growing demand, and not just our domestic demand, but the international demand and the bipartisan, bicameral push for us to be global leaders in this race, especially in front of adversarial countries. So, with that being said, you'll see these large number of investments that will continue to emerge and continue to be announced, not just from Amazon, but from other hyperscalers as well, in order to show how we're trying to meet the demand of now and prepare for the growing demand of the future.
And how do you prepare for the growing demand of the future? I know there's tons of investments that are taking place now, but it's likely that the demand for a computer is going to become exponential over time. So as a sort of strategic planning process, how do you guys think about that?
I think everything Amazon really focuses on is our customer and like seeing what our customers' needs are and work backwards from there. I think it's also developing and modernizing the technology so that the AI that as it develops will need less energy, less compute, et cetera. So we're hoping that as demand grows, but as the technology innovates and grows within itself, maybe there'll be less pressure on a certain need that 5 years ago was increasing, but now is steady or even decreasing because the technology is just now more advanced.
Great. So we have a sense of like change in demand for data centers, and we have a sense about where cloud companies are thinking about how they can keep up with that demand. If you were to think about it, as a firm's perspective, where do you see the main bottlenecks in terms of compute and AI? Is it related to capacity? Is it related to cost, latency, complementary inputs like skills or the grid? What do you think?
I think modernizing the grid is a huge priority. Permitting reform is going to be another huge priority. Also, the anti-data center sentiment that is more stringent than ever. Really started at the state and hyper-local level to the state level, and now you're seeing it at the federal level. We have, Senator Sanders introduced a moratorium on data centers. That piece of legislation with Representative Angela AOC saying that she would introduce a House version of it, Representative Ocasio-Cortez saying she would introduce a House version of it. That anti-data center sentiment that's really growing and that's honestly wide and bipartisan, without the proper education is going to be a huge bottleneck because there's going to be so much community pushback to the development and the expansion, and that essentially will, hinder legislators and lawmakers from allowing these investments into their states.
It's really good. One other follow-up question on that is also in terms of the demand for compute and the build-out for data centers, you guys must have a lot of demand for certain types of skills to help you build that out. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Of course. So Mississippi top of mind because we just announced that. So we have one of our sites in Mississippi alone is hiring 75 Mississippi-based construction teams and construction firms. So it's the physical infrastructure as well. There are 2,000 new jobs, full-time jobs, as a result of this latest development. So you have the jobs to support the growth, and then you have the jobs that the growth and the demand will then lead to. Outside of just the construction jobs and the jobs that will come as a result of the infrastructure there, you have to think about the community investments and what that does for a community and the upskilling, reskilling, workforce development, workforce incentives and investments, and how that will also generationally change a community by these investments are happening in non-traditional tech communities, and the benefits of these investments being there and the community benefits and what it's going to do for the generational change as a result of that, I think will be pretty significant.
Yeah, so it's definitely obvious. I think that we're undergoing a technological restructuring of the entire economy.
Yeah.
And we find it in the productivity statistics. We're seeing it in the demand for skill composition, but we're also seeing it in the demand for cloud computing, and that's resulted in a build out of this investment across the country. And part of that build out is reliant upon the electricity grid, which I think next I'll move to Rachel. Based on your research, to what extent are energy and grid constraints already bottlenecks for AI and data center deployments in the US?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as we just heard, they already are pretty sizable constraints that we're seeing out in the real world. I think something to remember as we're doing this is companies are building out in part to meet current demand, but also to meet demand that might materialize in the future. So when we're thinking about what the data center technologies are going to look like in the future, if we imagine a very cutting edge server, for example, one of these server racks is about the size of a refrigerator. And there are some projections that are saying that by 2030, these servers could have a peak energy demand equivalent to that of 65 homes. And I think that just sort of shows you the scale of which that we're talking about this build out. The main challenge here is that the current energy grid was not built to accommodate such a rapid expansion of energy demand. The data centers are coming online much faster than the grid can keep up in terms of generation and transmission development. A data center can come online between 18 and 24 months, but if we're looking at generation, that can take 4 to 5 years. Transmission can take 7 to 10 years. So there's this really large mismatch between the timelines that we're looking at here. And with that, data centers are facing very long wait times just to get energized on the grid. They're becoming very creative in how they move around this, but this is going to be a foreseeable bottleneck well into the future. So I think we're at a point now where we have a chance for some really good policy changes that'll help both make sure that we are at the cutting edge of AI adoption and data center technology, but then also making sure that the grid remains reliable for all customers.
That's really helpful, Rachel. I think looking back at your paper, you made some comparisons across states within the U.S. And I think, if I remember correctly, the comparisons that you made were between Virginia and Texas. How do these differences in how states have regulations and policies around around the electricity grid, and how is it impacting the market for where data centers decide where they want to reside?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the Texas-Virginia issue is really interesting because these are the two largest data center markets in the United States. They're facing very similar challenges in terms of they need reliable electricity demand. They're having a hard time forecasting what this demand might look like in the future. They're struggling to determine what a fair cost allocation could look like for these build-outs. There's a lot of questions around how these two states should be regulating large loads that are coming onto the grid. The interesting thing we're seeing between Texas and Virginia is the fact that their market designs have really changed the approaches that they're taking. So Texas, for example, the ERCOT is what manages the Texas grid. It's an ISO that's largely separate from the rest of the United States. And so because of that, it actually has lower political barriers in many regards. This past year, we saw the passage of Senate Bill 6 in Texas, which was one of the first really major pieces of data center legislation, and really just large load governance in general. It has reforms for the planning process, for the interconnection process, various operation and flexibility requirements, and it's really a good indication of how other states might move as well. Virginia is different. Virginia is in PJM, which is a regional transmission organization. They are not only responding to Virginia stakeholders, but they have to consider the needs of stakeholders across their region, which is 13 states and the District of Columbia, which means they have a lot more people to answer to. They've had a few different pieces of legislation come forward, primarily around taking away the tax exemptions for various pieces of data center hardware, as well as a number of other different proposals that, for the most part, have not passed, with the notable exception of the GS5 large load tariff. So all this to say, I think we're already starting to see major changes in how governments are legislating data centers, and I think that will be pushing the companies themselves to reconsider their own siting because of that.
And do you think it's happening already?
I do think it's happening already. I think we're seeing grid capacity as the major question around data center siting. On one hand, we're seeing developers choosing locations based off of where they can get interconnected most quickly. At Harvard, we have a study ongoing trying to understand how can we pinpoint places on the grid that might be able to best accommodate data centers, and then how can we use that to incentivize them to build at particular locations that will be helping the grid. At the same time, we're also seeing that as data centers are moving towards more inference instead of training, they're going to be moving closer to population centers, because at that point, you want to make sure there's low latency for the users and experience. So that means that, as there are more different types of data centers moving towards this inference, that's also going to be impacting the siting decisions. The one thing I do want to say is we're already seeing some areas where this may not be the case. Most in particular are the fact that many data centers coming online right now are trying to find ways to get power faster. And that might mean bringing their own power, such as behind the meter generation, small modular gas turbines, solar and battery systems, or co-locating at existing power plants. So that makes them less reliant on having to site within a particular geography. The challenge there is the supply chain is making that also very challenging. All this to say, I think we are already seeing that the power issue is playing a large role in the siting. But in terms of how that develops in the future, I think will depend a lot about how we decide to start regulating these large loads, and then also how the supply chain shapes out over the medium term.
Rachel, thanks a lot for that. Olivia, I think you probably have something to say a bit about the electricity grid and data centers coming from Amazon. How do you feel about the constraints of the grid, and to what extent does that influence where data centers are built?
Yeah, I think if you look at when the grid was, first, the main latest update was in the 70s or 80s. And if you look back at the 70s and 80s, nobody would have thought about, if you look back 10 years ago, nobody would think about where we are now, right? And the actual need that we have and what's happening with AI and the immense need, the continuously growing need, et cetera. But I do think the onus is both, look, most of the large investors in data centers are also willing to invest in the grid. So it's a public-private partnership. It's not all on government to help modernize the grid. And I do think that a lot of the responsibility is rightfully put on industry. And I think the onus is on us to also play our part here. The grid modernization is probably, I would say, top 3 issues, definitely in the top 3 of what we need in order for this infrastructure to work efficiently and continue to expand in the best way.
Josh, do you have anything to say about the skills related to the grid? I know I didn't prep you on this at all, or we didn't talk about it, but do you see anything from LinkedIn from the demand skill side set?
Yeah, so data centers, including grid build-out, we've seen 1 million jobs in the last year, which is a huge number. But like granularly getting down to grid and grid-adjacent work, not really.
Olivia, can I ask you then more from a cross-country perspective? I know we're thinking about it more from a U.S. perspective. Do we see differences in the demand and build-out of data centers across countries? Because we hear a lot about it.
I think anti-data center sentiment is a little... The issue that's different the main issue that's different between domestic and international is a sovereignty issue.
Yeah.
Right? And so you have anti-data center sentiment for sure, but then you have, countries like France saying we have a lot of energy, people should invest here. But then as a U.S. company, you're then having another challenge, which is going to be sovereignty.
Yeah.
That's probably the biggest distinction.
Thank you. Now, Carol, please jump in. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, even in the numbers that I quoted, I didn't include data center sort of physical investment. So that would have just made my numbers ever so slightly larger. It's big bucks, but it's also on top of big bucks, so a couple tenths maybe.
Great. So I think we've framed the conversation that we're seeing productivity effects, and we've discussed a lot of the key enablers of it, which includes skills, data centers, compute, and the electricity grid. Now, let's move more towards an open conversation where we'll discuss this across the panelists. And I'd like to start first, since we went from left to right, now let's go from right to left. And I'll start with you, Rachel. Given how these constraints reinforce each other in practice, where can policymakers intervene most effectively to try and unlock the greatest gains from AI diffusion?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think in my mind, there are two things that come to mind. I think first, it's absolutely right. We need more public-private stakeholder coordination. I think that's something that, especially on the grid side, is very much lacking. And when you think about it, I mean, our electricity system is extremely complex in terms of the stakeholders, the people who, you know, work on it, operate it, are doing generation, transmission, not to mention ratepayers, communities, government, industry. And I think, finding new ways that we can create better coordination within all of these different stakeholders is going to unlock a lot of ways for us to figure out the best way to really modernize the grid for the new era. I think outside of that, one thing that I think policymakers could have a very large hand in is trying to get more transparency in data center planning and utility planning. I think these are two areas where having that transparency will help everyone understand what the current constraints in the system are, and then also try to think about how, with that coordination, we can really be moving towards a system that's working for everyone.
Great. Josh, from a skills perspective, how about you? What could policymakers do to unlock these bigger gains from AI and productivity?
Yeah, I think the administration's doing this, Congress is doing this, but more public-private partnership to get real-time, accurate data to policymakers and to the public, to both inform policy and to inform workers of like what skills truly are in demand. That would be really helpful. Broadening and building out workforce training pipelines, both in the public sector and incenting the private sector would be great. Passing bills like WIOA, which got marked up this week, is a step in the right direction, but proportionally a lot more has to happen to meet this challenge in this moment.
Thank you. Olivia, I think you were the first person to mention public-private partnership. Yeah. So since we've already discussed that, can you think of anything else that you think that policymakers could do to help us unlock greater productivity gains from AI?
Education. I think that there needs to be an education on what exactly, it sounds silly, but when you go into certain offices, you kind of have to describe what AI actually is. Then you go into what generative AI actually is. Then you go into what agentic is. And I think that before you legislate, I think there needs to at least be a base level understanding of what you are opining on. So I think education is really important. And then those of who have more than just a lay knowledge of the technology, understanding what is our option if we don't innovate. What is our option if we don't move quickly? I think some people assume that moving quickly and innovation means lack of security or lack of safety, and that's not necessarily the case at all. There can be a balance where you promote secure and safe AI, but you still think of innovation and moving quickly as like a standard or a priority.
Great, thank you. Carol, can we move it to you, given your experience in the Fed and the Conference Board? What do you think?
Well, we've been talking a lot about infrastructure, which is very important. Compute capacity, grid investment, technical talent, and the pipelines or technical talent, as was just mentioned. Those things really matter. But let me make a case for a policy lever that's currently underweighted, I think, and that's organizational readiness. It's really the demand side of, they're talking about how we can increase the supply. It's the firms that have to adopt it. I already mentioned that in our results, the use channel was really important. But the binding constraint is typically not GPU or cloud service access. It's whether the firm has the data governance, the R&D capability, and the management practices to absorb and leverage those tools. I mean, one of the big lessons from the internet was that it was around for a while, and everybody talked about revolutionary influences or evolutionary developments that would emerge from it. But it really wasn't until firms reorganized production that the gains really happened. So the current sort of structure of production is like a constraint, a binding constraint, and firms need to imagine and then implement ways to reorganize it to take advantage of AI. and that is a gap that STEM policies and compute policies, can't fill. And I think that I could elaborate, but I think that's sort of just policies that build a base around R&D and organizational knowledge are equally important.
Yeah, and those barriers to reorganization are pretty big. I mean, if we step back and think about AI more generally, before generative AI, we classified AI as machine learning. And AI as machine learning was a more advanced algorithm which gave a recommendation to a human, and then the human made the decision. And ML was simply replacing existing, simpler, less sophisticated algorithms that were already in place in the mid-2000s that were being used. So it was like patchwork technology diffusion of AI within the organization. Generative AI is a different animal. I mean, it requires a complete reorganization of tasks, workflows. The ability of the businesses to reorganize around the tool is going to be big.
Right. I mean, if you think of the Amazon delivery system, I mean, online buying was electronic shopping is what, don't you remember that phrase? Was there. It started to happen, but it wasn't until there was this complete reorganization of how that worked. Encapsulated in the Amazon delivery system, which was about transportation networks, logistics, just a complete reorganization of how the existing system worked, that you really unlocked the gains of the internet in that case. So that's what we're talking about here, that there are binding constraints, and it's up to the imagination and the creativity within firms to unbind them.
Thanks, Carol. Rachel, we started off with you and we talked about what policymakers could do to enable greater gains from AI. Let's take a more broader question and ask what type of information or research would be helpful, or evidence that's currently not there that we could provide to policymakers that would help figure out how greater productivity gains could be unlocked from AI?
Yeah, so I think in my mind, the first thing that comes to mind is more transparent data on how much data center energy data centers are really using. The current estimates that we have, if you look across different consulting groups, different other research organizations, by 2030 are saying that data center electricity demand could be anywhere between 200 terawatt hours and 1,000 terawatt hours. That's a huge difference in scale. So I think having more transparency in this energy usage would help a lot of people. It would allow utilities to do better forecasting and better planning. It would allow them to figure out how much infrastructure do we really need to build to accommodate all of this new load coming online. And with that, it would also reduce substranded assets that also need to then be paid by other ratepayers in the system. The other thing that would allow us to do is it would also help us to create better agentic AI models to operate the grid itself. Like I mentioned, the grid is now at a point where it is very, very, very complicated, and human operators are starting to really struggle to maintain reliability and stability on the system. So getting this extra information about really what kind of energy demand are we looking at would really just help us improve the reliability and the stability of the whole system. And with that, I mean, that's going to improve economic productivity just across the board.
Olivia, what do you think? What bit of information, data, research do you think in your mind would be helpful for us to figure out how we really unlock productivity and diffusion from AI?
I think it's by use and by practice. I think that's the best way to learn, is through experience, and then you reiterate based on that experience and what you learn from the mistakes, from the successes, from the transparency, making sure that there's a transparency so everyone, like industry-wide, will share what those mistakes may be or what they've learned along the way. I think it's just all by use.
Yeah, and to some extent, I think that's what Carol was saying. What's the demand going to be?
Yeah.
The technology, because that would help answer what's the demand on the grid going to be? What's the demand for data centers going to be? And what's the demand for skills? So going to that then, Josh, what do you think is do we need to know?
Yeah, I mean, so first and foremost, the narrative of displacement and broad displacement has gotten a lot of traction with policymakers and the public. So policymakers having better fidelity and understanding that that's really not the case as of yet. That's a big caveat, but as of yet. So having a better understanding of what jobs are insulated, what's really happening in real time in the workforce, because we're not seeing that causal or corollary between AI uptake and displacement. Secondly is BLS, ONET, and the private sector doing a better job at going below the job titles and really getting specific about what skills are needed to do those jobs and tasks and subtasks, and then creating a system that allows employers to identify who has those skills in an efficient, scalable way. And I think the private sector and the public sector is grappling with this. OPM implementing the Chance to Compete Act is a really important step forward. But frankly, the private sector is lagging behind in that respect.
Thanks, Josh. What do you think, Carol?
Well, I think there's three gaps in order of how much I think they're holding back research and policy. I would say the first is measurement, sort of first and foremost. Our GDP statistics don't capture quality change in prices for AI services, and they still don't really properly capture or delineate AI capital or the full scope of software R&D investment. Now, we've made some progress on those areas in our work. One of the drivers of the software capital results that I mentioned is software R&D, which, by the way, you won't find anywhere in the GDP statistics. I had to dig it out of survey data from the NSF. So anyway, but the bottom line is we're making consequential decisions about a technology that we can't fully see, we don't see properly in the data. And then the second is on firm level diffusion. Well, I would just go straight and say, if we want to know what separates adopters from laggards, is the key question. And LinkedIn is sitting on the data that can answer that. Skills, hiring patterns, organizational change. And I genuinely would like to see that connected to productivity outcomes in firms. I think there's just a huge payoff there. And well, one could go on about how that could be done. And then the third is international comparisons. The cross-country measurement sort of dimension is very thin. And we need internationally comparable data on investment in AI and its diffusion and then the productivity impacts. That's one of the ways that it's almost sort of a laboratory for policy in some sense. So all in all, I think we're at a moment where the technology is moving faster than our ability to measure it, and that measurement gap itself is a policy problem. So that's how I'd square the circle.
Yeah, I agree. I think the sounding alarm here is that we need more data, really. We need a better understanding of how the technology is getting diffused throughout the economy. I don't just ask questions, I also do some research on AI, and most of the main surveys on AI are 0, 1 dummy binary variables. Does a firm use it or not?
Yeah.
We don't know where it's being used. We don't know how it's being used. We don't know how much they spend on it. We don't know which employees are touching it. So there's so much more that we can do. And like you guys all alluded to, the cross-country comparison is going to matter because technology matters for aggregate productivity growth. And what explains the differences of incomes across countries is aggregate productivity growth. So these are all very important. But I'm tired of asking questions. And I think now it's time to put it on the audience. And I already see one question. Do we have microphones for the people in the audience? So raise your hand and we'll bring a mic to you and we'll try to answer your question as best as possible.
My name is Mike Nelson. I work for the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. I've been working for 40 years on this topic, starting with the Senate Science Subcommittee, where I was Al Gore's advisor on all things internet technology and the rest. Being old doesn't mean I'm smart, but it does mean I have seen the boom of the internet. I've seen the dot-com boom. I've seen the cloud boom, the Internet of Things boom, and now I've seen the AI boom. In all cases, whether I was at Microsoft or the White House or Cloudflare, my job was to stop stupid stuff. Usually by getting people to rethink their myths and myth perceptions. So this is the perfect panel to ask this question. What is the worst myth, the most dangerous myth that is percolating out there, that is distorting policy decisions? And if that's too negative, tell me what myth you would like to, or what slogan, a true slogan, you would like to insert into the brain of every person in this building. And to give you an example, the myth that I've been talking about for 6 years is data is the new oil. That's not an AI myth, that's a digital policy myth. Positive slogan was one we came up with at IBM, which e-commerce is cool. E-business will change everything. And that's exactly what you were saying about getting the whole company. But the other big problem, the AI myth that I always start with, is talking about AI when nobody knows what is and is not AI, and particularly trying to create a whole new policy for AI, is just totally misguided, because we need to look at all of digital policy. We need to look at collaboration tools. I mean, most of the boom in the last 5 years was actually everybody getting online because of COVID, moving to the cloud. So we have to look comprehensively. That's my first myth. I'd like to hear your myths. And make it tweetable, because that's when the myths are most dangerous.
So who would like to start? What do you think is the major myth? Yeah, go ahead, Rachel.
I can start. So going back to the idea of education, which I think is completely correct, I think one myth that I would love to see go away is that every data center only exists to generate funny videos. I think that's something that, when I hear people casually talking about AI and data centers, that's usually what they know of. And I think it makes sense. I think in the media, that is what is being shown, and that is how the connection is being made. I think if we can really educate people what data centers are used for, what they're doing, I think we put communities in a better position to know whether they want that there, but also put policymakers in a better position to understand how many do we need, what is the, national competitiveness impacts of this technology. So I don't know if I have a slogan, but I'll think about it. I'll get back to you. Yeah.
I think a myth is AI is bad. I think that's pretty forward. If you remember when the camera first emerged, people thought that was going to be the end of art, because at that time, art was solely portraits, right? And so when the camera emerged, it was like, we're no longer going to have art in the world. And that introduced modernism and everything that we know of art today. So I think that if we lean into the immense opportunity of AI and not the negative of AI, it's the possibilities are endless. And whether it's workforce, education, food insecurity, healthcare, all of the benefits that are going to come from this technology, we lean into that and we can flourish. If we sit in AI is bad, it's going to take away jobs, it's going to keep, it's going to cause people to stay in more, not have social relationships, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. If we lean into the negative of it, I think that hinders us.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Carol.
Yeah, I mean, this is sort of the second, pretty much what she just said, but this myth that AI is going to take away all the jobs. This happens with every technological revolution going back to the Luddites. And it's never really come true, because what happens is that there's a lot of complementarities in the world, and new ones emerge and new jobs emerge. There is a long-term secular decline in the labor share of total income. It's slow, but it's been going on for a long time. And we have not seen it speed up with AI. And I think unless and until these binding constraints of the current production structure are completely obliterated, we're not going to see the end of of labor as we know it. So AI is real, and just get on board with the new skills that are needed. And yes, it's a totally positive picture. Again, I don't want to go on, but 10 years ago when computer vision broke through, it was one of the big breakthroughs, first breakthroughs in AI before the LLMs. Everybody said there will be no jobs for radiologists in 10 years. Meanwhile, the number of people with medical degrees entering residencies for radiology has gone up. It's made their job easier, it's made their job better, we're getting better diagnostics, but the doctor's still in the equation. Now, you know, maybe in some very distant future, people will trust AI to the extent that they don't now, and they won't want that interpretation from a trained radiologist. But that's just, you know, that's not in the next 10 years, and it's not in the next 15 years. So I think we should get real about this stuff. It just hasn't happened in the past, and we're just on this very slow sort of trend line, and that's going to continue for a while.
How about you, Josh?
Yeah, so I think policymakers understand there's a global competition afoot. I think the central myth is that they think we're running away with it. I think they
Yes.
look at
Good point.
Yeah, I
Good
totally
point.
do. I think they look at frontier models, all the research we do, data centers, but thanks to Microsoft data, the U.S. ranks 24th in diffusion. So the actual uptake from companies utilizing AI is lagging severely behind. So although we have all this kind of comparative competitive advantage, this diffusion piece, which is critical and foundational to really leveraging AI, we're falling behind by a lot.
Great. One other question? Well, we have time for a couple. Yes, please.
That was a hard question to follow. That's really good.
Very good.
But Jeffrey Frank, Small Business Administration, Office of Advocacy. I focus a little bit on energy issues. In talking about Texas and Virginia, I thought that was an interesting comparison. I don't know if I heard what some of the features were of the Texas grid and policy that could translate to other places. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about that. And then maybe for Olivia, I heard 3 different places in the country, none of which were Texas, but I think all have in common that they've got more infrastructure built out, maybe more like in generation lower costs, and that feels like a different story. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about, is that the case, or why Amazon chose the places that they chose for these recent build-outs?
Yeah, no, happy to elaborate. So the Senate Bill 6, going back a little bit, one of the big concerns right now that we're seeing with regards to data center build out on the grid is the interconnection queue. With that, it takes a long time to get energized once you enter that queue. So data center operators have been trying to find new ways to sort of expedite that process or just to get around it completely. One of the ways they're doing this is through what we call phantom interconnection requests, which basically means if you have one project, they're putting it in multiple different interconnection queues to try to see which one is fastest. So that's great for them because it means they get energy faster. It's not great for the grid because in their projections, they're still trying to, make sure that that power comes online, even though it may not be needed. So I think one of the big things that this bill does is it really starts to tackle that problem. One of the things it has is you are required to provide much more upfront information when you're entering that queue. So very specific information about what the data center is, what it's used for, operations. You're also required to pay pretty substantial fees for entering that queue and for doing the planning studies, both of which are, really there just to disincentivize that speculation. I think that's one of the really big ones. Within that, there are also some flexibility things that they're having them to do in terms of being more flexible with their demand and demand responsive. But yeah, it's a very impressive bill. It's very, very, very large. And I think it's going to become an interesting case study for the rest of the country. I think I mentioned it was only passed just this past year, so it's very new. But I think watching how it develops, how it's implemented, and how effective it is going to teach the rest of the country a lot in terms of whether this was the right approach or not.
In terms of how we decide where we're going to expand infrastructure, land is clearly a big issue, and power is a big issue. I didn't name all of the states in which, of course, I wouldn't name states that we haven't announced yet, but we have announced a $5 billion investment in Texas near the Comanche Park region. It's a 435 acre campus that was the Comanche Peak nuclear plant. So that's going to be starting in 2027.
Great. I think we have one more question.
Yeah, thanks so much. Mine is also around the energy data center intersection, because you highlighted transparency as something we would need policymakers to intervene on. Is that because we're not seeing the insides of the agreements between tech companies, data center builders, and utilities? I mean, Amazon is great to have Amazon here. Have you guys shared anything in terms of like what projections for energy use would be in terms of, what, investments utilities would need to make, and how that might or might not translate to ratepayers having to foot the bill? I know that some tech companies in more recent sort of pledges have said, okay, we'll agree to pay all the costs even if we don't use it in the future, if this all turns out to be a bubble. But yeah, talk a little bit more about the need for transparency, if there are any good examples. Amazon, feel free to weigh in, Olivia. Yeah.
I think that, yes, having a solid utility partner is key. Mississippi's on my mind because we literally just announced the expansion in Mississippi last week. But our utility partner in Mississippi is Entergy. With our partnership with Entergy has something called Power Mississippi, where they're saving ratepayers $2 billion and $700 million in fuel, just based off of the Amazon partnership and investments. We have something called the E3 Ratepayer Study Pledge that shows that, specific to Amazon and the way in which we develop and build out our infrastructure, we pay more than our fair share of our energy costs, and we do not transfer any of that energy cost onto the local consumers. However, we're still empathetic to the fact that because Amazon does something doesn't mean the entire industry does. And so we work with the Data Center Coalition, and we work with other industry, the majority of the industry, to make sure that there are these common practices so that the entire industry doesn't get a bad name. Yet there are still bad actors, and you see these lawsuits that are playing out right now with the NAACP Legal Defense Fund in Tennessee, et cetera. And so there needs to be, something. We were a part of the ratepayer pledge, ratepayer protection pledge that we signed with the White House. The White House is trying to get that codified in Congress, and it's last I heard, Chairman Guthrie wants it to be a state and local issue, and he thinks that the state should handle it, and it shouldn't be something done at the congressional level. But we don't control the entire industry, though we tend to get all the pushback from everything. But I do think that the way in which Amazon is developing and expanding their data center footprint is justly done. And the E3 study shows that.
We do have one final question, but I ask it very brief, and then whoever responds, very brief as well.
Okay, I don't know if I can ask that question then. So actually, I wanted to, being the last person to ask a question, I wanted to lighten the mood a little bit. I was on a panel recently talking about AI, and one of the questions that was asked, which was, describe the most interesting, fun use of AI you've done in recent life. And, I responded by saying, I work with my community on planning issues, and I use AI to determine where playground we're trying to build for seniors should be built, which park it should be built into the city. So I would just love to hear each one of you talk a little bit about how you use AI in your daily lives within the last, several weeks.
Can we do 30 seconds a person? Is that okay?
Yeah. I used AI today for my LinkedIn post.
Love it. Love it.
I don't know. Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. So this was not me. preface it with that, but I think it's very cool. I have a friend who was doing a geographic information systems project that he was also using AI as part of, where he was reconstructing his family's ancestral lands that he had all the documents for, and like putting them together and trying to understand where they came from and what it looked like and everything else. And it was amazing.
I'm planning a trip to Japan, and it's really complicated, so it's super helpful with that.
Oh, I'll be really boring. The paper that I wrote, I did the old-fashioned way. I just finished a paper in record time using Claude. It has sped up my ability to do research, not just by being a research assistant, but by rounding out the economic reasoning that gets down on paper. I think it's pretty amazing. And I think the greatest contribution AI is going to have is in science, not economics, but pure science. Yeah.
Agree.
I want to, me too? I use it for coding a lot. I used it for coding yesterday to work on a bug.
Yeah, it sounds
Claude?
boring, but you know.
It's very helpful, and it increased my productivity by at least 100%.
Yeah.
I want to thank the audience. I want to thank the panel for all their insights and their expertise. I want to thank the audience for your great questions and your patience. We have alcohol for everybody here. We've usually done this over lunch, and we give sandwiches, and we thought, let's experiment with alcohol. So we're going to have a cocktail afterwards, but I just want to keep you guys in the loop. We do these events occasionally on the Hill. As you can tell from the discussion from the audience, the next event that we're going to do is around cloud computing and AI. And then the follow-up session after that is going to be on AI and antitrust. So those will be coming in the near future. So I hope you're able to attend. Tell us if you like the lunch or the cocktail version of it better. We'll listen to you and we'll follow up shortly. So thank you very much.